In addition to economic concerns of the conservative movement, there are a lot of concerns coming from social values. And in particular, we see a group within the conservative movement of the 1970s that nicknames themselves the religious right. So these are largely driven by evangelical Christians. Okay, remember, evangelical Christianity is denominations like, for example, Baptists, who believe in a more activist faith, right? Evangelism means to spread the good news. So much more concerned about spreading faith and spreading their interpretation of morals and values. And evangelical Christians in the 1970s were becoming an increasingly large group. There's a growth of membership within evangelical denominations like Baptists, while the mainstream kind of denominations within Protestant Christianity, like, for example, Presbyterians and Methodists and Episcopals, are seeing declining membership during the 1970s. Evangelical Christians saw themselves and their traditional religious values as the solution to the problem of declining morality in society. And so they expressed an interest to get involved more and more in politics to help bring morality back into American political and public life. So the religious right, these evangelical Christian conservatives wanted to repeal a ban on prayer in public schools. They wanted to outlaw pornography or anything that they saw as um, immoral or sinful. Pornography, by this point in time, had been declared free speech. They also wanted to push back against Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court case that had legalized abortion. They wanted to return to a time in which abortion was illegal. Now, one of the driving forces of evangelicals contributing in political movements in the 70s are the rise of very influential evangelical preachers. In particular, preachers like Jerry Falwell came into public prominence by using not only mass mailings, but also televisions to hold services and kind of televised versions of the old-fashioned revival to get out the message. And in particular, to promote not only let Jesus save you, come and join our church, but also, hey, you should go and vote for this politician. You should focus on electing people who are pro-family values to the government to affect political change. Jerry Falwell is going to coin a term called moral majority. So he's riffing here off of Nixon's silent majority from 1968. Remember, Nixon had said that most Americans did not support the excesses of the 1960s, and that it was just a vocal minority who were part of these civil rights protest movements. Jerry Falwell is similarly going to say that what we'd seen with the civil rights movements and the sexual revolution and everything else was, again, the work of a minority of Americans, and that the vast majority of Americans disapproved of the direction of the country. Falwell and other preachers used very religious language to condemn political opponents. Falwell once used the phrase followers of Satan to describe his political opponents. And the end goal for the religious right was really to elect politicians who were sympathetic to their values and ideas and would enact these changes. So in many ways, this is a return to the idea of moral liberty that we saw in the 1950s with the rise of the new conservatives, right? This idea that it's perfectly acceptable and in this case advisable to enact some kind of morality into your laws, right? To ban what you see as sinful and immoral behavior for the good of public society. Now, social conservatism is also going to come crashing headlong into the women's rights movement in the 1970s, largely over the Equal Rights Amendment. So you may remember our discussion of the Equal Rights Amendment from the 1920s, because the Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed by suffragette Alice Paul as the next logical step after women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. The idea of an Equal Rights Amendment was simply to include language in a constitutional amendment to state that men and women were the same politically, socially, and economically, that they had the same rights under the Constitution. It didn't go anywhere in the 1920s, but it was picked back up again in the late 60s and early 70s. And in 1972, with bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats, the Equal Rights Amendment language was approved, and the amendment was sent to the states for ratification. Supporters saw the amendment as necessary for fully granting women equal protection and freedom in the Constitution, but the Equal Rights Amendment was pushed back on by social conservatives. Phyllis Schlafly was one of the leading voices against the Equal Rights Amendment ratification. She countered that the Equal Rights Amendment would actively undermine traditional gender roles, and it would prohibit women from becoming stay-at-home wives and mothers. So in other words, the Equal Rights Amendment wasn't about ensuring that, at least on paper, men and women had the same rights, but rather it would force less traditional social roles, that it would prevent you from having a more sort of traditional relationship, or it would prevent you from being a stay-at-home wife and mother. And even though this was not the intention of the Equal Rights Amendment, this did spark a widespread movement against it. And in fact, the Equal Rights Amendment will fail to be ratified. It's one of the few times in American history where an amendment has had a deadline on it. The Equal Rights Amendment had until a certain year to be ratified by the minimum number of states necessary. And the Equal Rights Amendment did not meet that, which means it is not part of the Constitution today. Now, interestingly enough, several states moved to ratify it after the deadline. Some states also moved to retract their initial approval of ratification after the deadline. These are things that, again, not traditionally happened in amendments. In fact, our most recent amendment to the Constitution took over 200 years to get actually added. It took 200 years to get the minimum ratification votes needed. But Virginia, just this year, as of recording, 2020, became the last state to ratify. So, meaning if you don't allow states take backsies, so in other words, a state cannot retract the ratification. Again, not sure on the legality of that. This has not happened before. And if you say, deadline kind of tricky and suspect, then technically with the Virginia vote, the ERA has overcome the last hurdle. Now, it doesn't quite work that way because, again, we're in sort of untested constitutional waters. So this is part of the reason why the ERA ratification effort has been back in the news lately. There's been some desire to seek clarification on all these sticky issues surrounding it and to see whether it is still alive, we could potentially add it to the Constitution, or whether we need to go back and start all over again. Another issue involving women that gets a lot of social conservatives riled up in the 1970s is a desire to push back the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade, which declared that women had a constitutional right to abortion. And conservatives argued that this was not ethical because Roman Catholics and evangelical Christians define life as starting from the point of conception, not birth. So if you define life as beginning when sperm meets egg, then to their eyes, any form of abortion after the fact, no matter how early, would be equivalent to murder. And so we see an interesting coalition of Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants who don't necessarily get along with each other historically, united to oppose the issue of legal abortion. In part due to conservative pressure, Congress in 1976 votes to end federal funding of abortion through Medicare over Gerald Ford's veto. And this pressure, this debate over the issue of abortion will continue until today. We're still grappling with this issue of abortion. But really, in the 1990s is when this conflict of abortion gets the most extreme, as we'll talk about in a future session, when we start seeing a pattern of clinic bombings and abortion providers being targeted for murder to oppose legal abortion.